Hi everyone, and Michelle, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jo. Nice to be here.
Now listen, we're here to talk today on the topic of difficult conversations. As recruiters, you sure do have a lot of them. And in fact, I went out to our brilliant TA community and asked for your feedback on what are the most difficult conversations you find yourselves having? What would you like some help with? I have those 5, and Michelle, our resident expert from People of Influence, is here to coach you about difficult conversations and hopefully make them a little bit gentler and easier for you. So Michelle, first of all, can you give us a definition? Because I don't tend to call things difficult conversations. I like to frame them as being important or critical conversations, but share with us difficult conversations.
Yeah, thank you, Jo. Look, first of all, the important thing to understand is a difficult conversation in a work context is any conversations where 2 conditions hold. One is that it seems like you and the other person might have mutually incompatible goals. And the second is that you anticipate that there might be strong emotions on one side or the other or both. So in your industry, that's a lot of the conversations that you have in the course of a day. And a difficult conversation can be, you know, it could be a coaching conversation, it could be a feedback conversation, it could be all sorts of different conversations, but it also qualifies as a difficult one. So I know there are lots of people I work with in your industry who find that this is part of everyday life. And I agree with you that a reframe to important conversations is what's useful.
Now, are there some personalities that find sitting down and having usually hopefully a direct conversation and a difficult conversation more challenging than others?
Yeah, look, extroversion and introversion can be an important metric to look at here. I mean, the thing that most people will say to me who are challenged by difficult conversations is, I don't like confrontation. I really don't like confrontation. I don't enjoy it. And that can be associated with introversion versus extroversion. So people who are more introverted are often the ones who I would say need to spend more time planning the conversation ahead of time. If it's one that you can anticipate, you know, all of us have been in that situation where we start a conversation and it seems fine. And then all of a sudden we're like, oh,
go somewhere really different.
A difficult conversation all of a sudden that I didn't plan on having today. But at the times where you can plan it, I find introverts will need more time to plan it, more time to rehearse their opening, more time to think through how they want to say it, and prepare themselves for where it can go, because it's the strong emotion component in the criteria that makes it so difficult. So there is a personality component here. And if you know that you're going to have a difficult conversation with someone who you know, whether they are an introvert, whether they are more volatile, whether they might be a highly sensitive person, the most important thing to try to keep in mind is time. Can you give them response time? Can you give them a buffer between having the conversation or delivering the bad news or whatever it is, and when you require a response for them? So as much as you can open up that gap for those people, you're doing them a service to give them choice about when and how they respond and allowing them to do it in a more considered way.
As you're talking, I'm already thinking about all the different kind of scales in assessment in terms of I'm, you know, on the DISC scale, I'm a high DI, I'm an ID.
Yeah.
My I's a bit higher. And so high Ds can tend to be people who, you know, respond really quickly, make really quick decisions, and probably sometimes can find themselves in conversations that they may be unprepared for. So as you were saying before, it can actually be a blessing to be somebody who, you know, thinks, wow, you know, this difficult conversation I'm going into, I'm really going to have to plan this out and think about it, because you are more prepared. But look, the one common challenge that everyone has here, no matter who you are and what your personality type is, and is the types of conversations we regularly find ourselves in. So let's kick off with the first one. Number 1, declining candidates that have been referred by a mutual connection.
Now, this one to me falls into the bucket of delivering bad news. Right? This is often more of a one-way conversation, in the sense that the most important feature of the conversation is you need to decline them. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily need to be a long two-way conversation after that. So let me tell you one thing that will guide a lot of my responses in how to deal with these. And that is an understanding of people's threat triggers. So if, for example, I was walking down the street today and I encountered someone who had a vest on for a charity. Mm-hmm. I'm walking down the street and I see them. Immediately, what most of us will do, what do you do, Jo? Everyone has their different responses. What do you do in that situation?
Well, that's really interesting you say that, because I was walking with a friend and my immediate thing is, check out the charity, see if it looks legit, pull out some cash, right, and lean into it. Hers was to completely, walk around and just be like, this is an interruption to my day.
Yes. So, and this is exactly what you point to with personality, right? You, highly extroverted, not afraid of conflict, are like right in there. It's not a stressor for you. Whereas for the vast majority of people, what they do is essentially a flight response, fight or flight. It's a flight response of avert eye contact, cross the road, all of a sudden I need to be on my phone. It's anything they can do to avoid it. And then some people will, feel socially awkward about that, so have the conversation, but they just want to get out there. And then there's people like you who are completely fine with it. So a lot of the conversations that recruiters, hiring managers are all having with candidates especially, those conversations are going to trigger threat in other people because of the nature of the conversation, right? It's high stakes. You're going to reject me or not reject me. You're going to decline. The high stakes conversation. And that will be elevated anyway. So if you want to get the most out of that person in terms of their response, and you want to do it in the most compassionate yet professional way, you want to think about minimizing threat triggers. How can you mitigate that? How can you reduce it as much as possible in the way you deliver that bad news? So one of the key principles here is to be as direct and open as possible, as quickly as possible, to reduce the level of uncertainty.
Yeah.
Right? Tell the bad news as soon as you get on the phone. What's interesting is it's important to have a little bit of self-awareness about this, because people who are uncomfortable with these conversations often soften it or beat around the bush a bit. And when you dig into it or really analyze it, they're actually doing that because of their own discomfort.
Yeah.
They might tell themselves they're doing it for the other person, but actually the other person is triggered by this whole incident and they've got uncertainty looming large in their minds. So if you're really trying to serve them, if you're really trying to do the best thing for them, then the discipline for you to practice and the skill for you to develop is to say it as compassionately but as directly as you can.
Yeah, I really like that. And probably now is a good time to check in with the audience. And if you want to pop in the chat comments, is these sort of processes something that you include? Are you thoughtful and mindful about providing them with some autonomy and giving them some choice and allowing them to have some feedback and so forth? And while people are doing that, I might share the second difficult conversation. And this is also about declining a candidate, but it's a bit of a trickier situation with when it's an internal candidate and another internal candidate has been successful in securing the role. So you're going to have an ongoing relationship with both parties, and we've now got, one of those parties has been successful on the role and the other one hasn't. So they do have a little bit of more of a ability to yardstick their skills and experience over somebody else's versus the faceless successful candidate, right?
Absolutely. I think the biggest word with this one is transparency. Because this is not just a conversation. I mean, that's what we've been asked about. But like you said, this is going to be an ongoing thing to manage. And so how you set it up at the beginning is really important. You've got to be super transparent, but you have to be, you've got to make sure you're authentic, direct, and honest in the way that you do that for the sake of everybody. but not giving, again, this comes back to the autonomy and choice thing, not giving feedback that's unsolicited, and being even more sensitive in the way that you do that. Some of that comes down to the language that you use, and this is where you could even draw on Martin Seligman's explanatory styles in the way that you think about it, where to make sure that when you make comments or give feedback to explain, because you will likely have to explain this in terms of putting those two candidates up against each other, they're more likely to ask for feedback and a rationale for the decision. How can you, as much as possible, make sure you're explaining those differences in a way that has both a growth mindset and positive explanatory styles, not explaining it in a way that attributes it to characteristics that are permanent about the person or pervasive. So as much as possible, isolating the feedback to particular aspects of their performance, particular projects, things that they've done that they've not done, as opposed to overarching statements about personality, for example, you know, and attributing it to that, because that can be much more problematic in terms of the way those candidates process it. So
now
let's
check in with the audience again, because I know that many of you will have dealt with this scenario, and maybe you just want to share in the comments there, you know, what are some of the strategies that you've used, and how much of this is your responsibility as talent acquisition, and how much of it is actually their direct manager, or the, you know, if it's a different team, you know, the hiring manager within that team, in terms of, you know, that feedback and those relationships. So whose responsibility is it, and have you got any, you know, success stories and tips you want to share with everyone else? Michelle, moving on to number 3.
Yep.
Salary. So I don't know if you're aware, but the market's gone a little, hot at the moment.
Yeah,
and a lot of people are using this as the opportunity to ask for a few extra dollars. But of course, organisations have a budget. So managing salary expectations with, you know, candidates in a market where maybe people are asking for a little more than, you know, you typically pay or that you've got approval for.
Obviously, there's the comments we've made before about be as direct as possible, as quickly as possible. But in the context of this sort of conversation where you're rejecting, you know, you're asking about, you know, salaries and people are having different expectations, it's particularly important to have these conversations where you put numbers on the table as soon as possible, and that you don't have as much time between the conversations. So if you've got someone who has expressed, hey, my salary expectations have increased because, hey, look what's happened to the market, don't leave them hanging. Like have that managing expectations conversation as soon as possible, and be as explicit as you can with numbers straight away. Of course, you then have to be able to back it. You have to have a rationale for why that is. And the balance to be had here is to be validating and understanding and compassionate about their expectations and why they're currently inflated, and not being closed to future changes in terms of salary, but being really upfront about the situation right now. And further to that, what I see, and I see this mistake a lot, not being apologetic about the fact that you can't give more, just being open and realistic and compassionate and understanding, but saying this is where things are.
Right.
Not like, I'm really sorry.
Really sorry.
Do more, because when people get that repeatedly, but there's no actual action in terms of uplift, it just seems inauthentic, and it engenders a culture of low trust. Like, well, you know, if you guys are really sorry, there'd be more happening to shift this.
Yeah, let's head back to the chat feed. So, you know, from the perspective of salary expectations, you know, how many of you are finding yourself in those conversations at the moment based on the way the market is?
So another distinction too that I think is important here And it's related to this and how you give this, have these kinds of conversations. Is that, a decade or two ago, the recommendation when you were giving any kind of feedback was to really use the old shit sandwich formula, if I'm allowed to say that. Who knows, it's out there now.
Yes, you are.
and to cushion this bad news with all of those encouraging compliments that boost other people, at the front, top and tail it with that. And that's still what people tend to do. Again, they think, I think they feel that that's better for the receiver. But that's what they tell themselves. They're ostensibly doing it for the other person, but very often it's to fill in the gaps of their own discomfort.
Yeah.
And what we now know is that feedback is much better received if you do one thing in the conversation, because the shit sandwich, if you give something good feedback, negative feedback, and then good feedback, some people walk away from it going, 2 out of 3 was positive.
That's great.
Or there's this cognitive dissonance and they're confused. They're like, well, there was good stuff in there and there was not good. So what do I take from that? Are they even being straight with me? What's going on? So it's much more effective to do them separately. If you've got bad news, deliver the bad news, deliver it straight, have that conversation. If you want to go back with something else, have a separate conversation later, so that they're distinct. And the other reason to do that, if you're in a delivering bad news conversation or managing expectations about salary, which is also delivering bad news because you're saying you're not going to get the number you want. If you've got to have that conversation, once you've delivered the bad news, part of their brain shuts off.
Yeah.
Like they're not listening as much anymore. They're thinking about that and they're in the fallout from that. So if you actually want them to hear the compliments or the good feedback, do it at another time. And if you really want to give it, there's a difference between compliments and feedback. Compliments is just saying nice things to make people feel good, right? Feeling good is the objective. Feedback is actually a critique of specific behaviors that you've been doing that have led to a positive impact and explaining what the behaviors are and what the impacts are. So if you want to help the person, please give them good feedback. That's quality feedback that you've thought through and considered. These are the behaviors and things about you and what you're doing in your role that are fantastic. And here's why, because these are the impacts they're having. And give that, because that will really lift trust and help that person in a meaningful way. So think that through, plan it and give it, but as a separate conversation.
Love it. Now, moving into number 4. So we've got, and I'm looking at, and I've really taken exactly what people have told me. I haven't created these myself, and so it's obviously something people find challenging. But the first where we've got is declining. So declining candidates, but because the hiring manager has told you that they're a bad cultural fit, and I know a lot of people online are going to be cringing right now at that, and I suspect we're going to have some more feedback from the hiring manager here than for the poor candidate. What can you say in that scenario?
Yeah, look, you've got to find a way to say that, first of all, that is as honest a representation of what the hiring manager said without saying that, to my mind, because that means so many different things to so many different people. Now, but I should start by asking you, Joe, when you hear that written down, the hiring manager considered them a bad culture fit. There's lots of things people mean by that. What do you take that to be code for?
I think that's the first thing I would question, is that's just not enough information. And I like to ask people really awkward for them, can you explain exactly what that means? And can you provide me with an example of what that means? And typically then their own bias and own gaps tend to become a little bit more apparent, and you know what you're working with. But I think, to me, if I just take it on face value, I would probably guess that they're saying they're not like us. They're not going to fit into the norm of the team, the rhythm of the team. They're going to be different. And that's a real challenge, given a lot of recruiters, and a lot of organizations are aiming for cultural add rather than cultural fit. And that's why I think, maybe, and we'll come to your thoughts on this in a minute, Michelle, but maybe in the feedback, can people sort of share, have you had this scenario? Have you just had someone say bad cultural fit and then you're left to trying to figure out what that means? And, what did you do next in terms of the hiring manager and where you take that? Because that's a massive education piece.
Yeah, it is, because I tend to find people use it for that shorthand too, of they're not like us, they wouldn't fit in here. Now there's, as you've alluded to, there's the whole diversity piece there to be unpacked as to, people are making these decisions by gut, by instinct, by bias a lot of the time. And of course, there are certain times where part of the criteria is that they fit in certain ways to certain criteria. Like, that's the whole point. But which roles require that kind of fit for success, and where would diversity and difference be really valuable and be better in terms of that whole separate conversation. But if you're in the position where that's all you've got from the hiring manager and you can't dig any deeper, you can't be the Joe who asks the awkward questions and probes to get more from that, then I would be more inclined to reject the candidate and say, look, the decision has been made that you're not right, not the right person. I haven't been able to get any further feedback from the hiring manager as to why. Because I think saying bad culture fit or not similar enough or any of those other things is unnecessarily inflammatory.
Yeah.
To me, it's not substantive feedback. The candidate can't do anything with that.
Yep.
They can't do anything other than get angry, to be honest, or to get emotional. And that's what you're setting it up for in terms of threat triggers. Like, what do you do? What do you do?
Yeah.
So I would just say, which I think is honest, I've been told by the hiring manager that they haven't chosen you. I haven't been able to get substantive feedback as to why. And I would also expect, if you have to say something that alludes to the fact that it's a bad culture fit or whatever similar term you have to use, be ready to hold space for the emotions of the other person. And I'm sure, you guys have this quite a lot, where you call to deliver bad news and you have to hold space for emotions.
Yeah.
And that's even more important if you are in these conversations of rejection or declining or whatever, is to understand that as soon as you hear strong emotions on the other end of the line, one way or another, understand that that person has largely lost access to their prefrontal cortex. They're not really going to hear or take in anything else that you say in the conversation or be influenced by you or swayed. The best thing you can do is to wind it up with an option to talk again at some point. So give them autonomy or choice about that. Like, it's don't that push-pull thing. Do not push now. They've given a clear signal that, if they want to continue talking and they want that, in terms of empathy and listening, whatever, you make your professional judgment about how long you do it for. But you certainly don't try to bring in new information and new thoughts to push with. That's not going to work.
It's really thoughtful stuff, isn't it? And I think all of your suggestions are so valuable, and obviously the best way to go about it. I'm imagining right now there's a lot of people online going, how do I find the time to do all of this? And also I can see how once you're kind of digging through a lot of these scenarios, and why people would tend to hide behind an email.
But two things I would say to that, Joe. One is, if you want to be in your game for the long term and be one of the really, really respected professionals in the long term, you need to face into the human stuff, and as much as is humanly possible, not take the easy way out. Give them the phone call. Like, even for the introvert, for the person who's going to struggle with that confrontation on the other end, you give them the phone call and you make it short and you give them space, and you do further things with email if that's what you want. And only needs to be a 30-second conversation. It doesn't have to necessarily be longer than that, but it's so much more respectful to the other person.
Absolutely.
What I would say is, I know time is an issue here, but we've already seen with 3 of those difficult conversations that they're of the same theme, right? They're delivering bad news, and you guys do these at scale. You know, this is not like, oh, I do this once a month sort of, you know, they're more frequent than that for most of you. And so you prep it once and you practice it many times a day in many variations, many times a day or a week in many variations. So with all difficult conversations, I recommend for people to plan it, like script it, write the exact words that you're going to say for the whole conversation for the opening, for the first 2 or 3 sentences. How are you going to, as compassionately and directly as possible, pull that Band-Aid off?
Yeah.
Have the 3 sentences, whatever it is, worked out, have them rehearsed. That takes you 10 minutes, like really 10 minutes to write them down and say them a few times. And you're going to be on the phone. You can read it, for God's sake. And have that ready and tweak that for each different conversation that you do. And once you've done 10 of them, you won't be writing it down. You'll know which variant of it to use, and you'll tweak it over time, hopefully by listening to how people respond and what words frame it in the best way. But certainly don't get on those, make the call, don't send the email, but don't make it without having planned it. Because if you're really trying to be of service to the candidates, take 10 minutes to think it through once and use that script 20, 30, 50 times.
Across. Yeah. Well, and you make a great point, you know, that it's a skill you need to develop, you need to hone it. And I think, you know, there's so much that goes into other parts of the process, and, you know, building your interview competency and technology competency and all of these other things. This is like a really critical moment of the experience for the candidate. Now, 5th and final, here we go. Providing hiring managers feedback on their own interview skills, particularly when you see bias kicking in. And this was, you know, interview skills in terms of, you know, lack thereof, you know, their own development needs. Yeah. This is a tricky one, given it's a key stakeholder.
Yeah, it is a key stakeholder. Look, there's a few things to remember in approaching this. Giving any kind of feedback about unconscious bias is fraught, because bias, almost by definition, is subjective. So it's contentious. And you can argue someone's making a decision based on bias, and they can say, that's your bias. That, you know, that thinks that and interprets my behavior and my decisions in that way. So you have to tread carefully because of the very nature of it. This question, though, mentioned process, you know, wanting to help them understand what good process is. So if you're trying to broach this and give feedback, if you want the feedback to be better accepted and for the person to stay more open and not close in terms of threat triggers, you want to go back to what I alluded to before in the way that you structure the feedback, which is to be very clear about what behaviors, objective, if possible, observable behaviors you think were substandard, suboptimal, and what the impact of those behaviors were. So you said this, quote verbatim, right? Or you did this in the interview. You rolled your eyes and then turned away from them, whatever it is. Really objective behaviors that you can list, so that you can look at the list of behaviors and think, no one could argue with that. Like, that's what happened. It's not my interpretation of what happened. That's what happened. And understand from that, what was the impact? So you've got to get clear on those 2 things to talk about them. But at the top of the conversation, if you want this person, this key stakeholder, to be on board, you need to get alignment and agreement on the overarching goal, because you need to show that these behaviors and therefore the impact are not going to get either of you to the common goal that you share. So you need to, in planning that conversation, you've got to get clear on that as well. What have I and this hiring manager got in common in terms of what we're trying to achieve with you know, attracting and then retaining the best candidate for this particular role, whatever it is. Be clear on that, and you open the conversation with it. So if you've got, in this situation, it looks like there could be an argument brewing, right? Because you bring this up and you're going to say, look, you did that interview terribly and your unconscious bias is derailing this. It's your story. The other person's story might be like, you're absolutely ridiculous and you're reading into this a whole lot of stuff that is not there and I'm doing great. That's their story. So you've got your story and their story. If you start a difficult conversation with those two stories, you're setting yourself up for failure, right? So part of starting a difficult conversation is to identify what's the third story above both of those two that we could get agreement on at the outset, that we could align on. Is it something like, I'm sure you'd agree, Joe, that we both want to make sure we get the best possible candidate for this position?
Sure do.
And they would start going, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, we do. Okay, well, then I feel like I owe it to you to just call out a few behaviors I've seen in this last interview that are a bit of red flags, because I think they're going to take us away from that outcome.
It's shock.
Is it okay if we talk about that for a sec? My intention is not to blame you.
I'm very intrigued now, yes.
My intention is not to blame or point fingers. My intention is to work with you to make sure we're getting as close to that goal as we can. Is that okay? And then broach it as directly, but watching as carefully as you can in terms of their response as you can. Part of the reason to do that is to make sure they can vent, right? Or they can give their side of the story and get that off their chest as early as possible. And so you know their side of the story. You understand what's going through their head, because that's intel.
Well, I imagine you want to understand from their perspective, but also if they get it out, they're less likely to interrupt you as you're providing the feedback.
Because if you start going into that feedback, sometimes they can't hear you because they've got what they want to say and
their mental objections.
So let them have all that out at the beginning. And this basic process that I'm talking about is a build on some work by the Harvard Negotiation Project. They've got a book called Difficult Conversations, and it's to build on one of the processes they talk about for starting difficult conversations. The most important thing with these is the start and how you set the trajectory for that conversation. So they've got 3 steps. The first, well, they don't, I've elaborated on it and built on it, but the first step is agree on a shared third story, right? Which I just explained to you. I'm sure you'd agree, Joe. We're both just trying to find the best possible candidate, right? Agree on that bigger picture. And you've got to do some thinking beforehand to get clear on what that is too. Because otherwise you come in just going, you don't know what you're talking about. You've got unconscious bias all over the place, and you're in your story. You've got to have the mental discipline to see that first. So agree on a shared third story. And then you share your story, but only your intentions. My intention is not to blame you. My intention is to work with you because I've seen a few things that are red flags. And I'm feeling a bit concerned about that. So you share just your intentions and your feelings. And then the third step is open it up for their story before you go any further, right? Open it up to them so they can vent, so they can say all they want to say. And then they're more likely to listen to what your actual feedback is. And you also have got the intel of understanding things from their perspective. So you might weave that in to your feedback. You give it now, you might slightly amend what you were going to say to keep that in mind. So that would be a frame and a start that I would use when you're approaching this or other similar ones. Again, you've got to plan that. You've got to have your 3 first sentences mapped out and know
ready
what
to
you're
go.
This is high stakes. This particular one, because you're going to have ongoing relationship often with this kind of hiring manager. And so you want to make sure that you do this as well as you can. It's saying to somebody, you know, your unconscious bias is getting in the way and you're really not a great interviewer. It's pretty triggering. And you're likely to get strong emotions as a result. So you've got to make sure you don't do it that way. But you also...
And also people, given their main career is not recruiting, I mean, people only know what they know. They only know what they've been trained to do, what they've been exposed to. So it could just be highlighting the need for some genuine training uplift outside of the feedback.
Yes. And you want to, you know, give them the assumption of good intentions always, you know, and always assume it's a self-awareness gap or a skill gap, not ill intent.
Yeah.
And make that super explicit in the way that you frame it as well. You know, that, look, I know, Joe, we're both trying to work towards this with the best of intentions. I've seen a couple of red flags that make me think there might be something that I'm seeing that you're not. So I wanted to put that on the table in case that's the case.
This is so helpful, Michelle. We've got our 5. I'm sure everyone listening in today has got far more than that. And if you do, get in touch with Michelle at People of Influence. But I think this puts us all on a really positive path with a purposeful framework to be able to improve the quality of conversations that we're having, difficult or not, which I think is going to be a great outcome for all stakeholders. So thank you so much.
No worries. Lots of fun. Always good to chat to you, Joe.